Hello, and welcome back to Parley. This prompt was written by EyePatchNotes. Hope you'll enjoy listening. It's about, a detour, developing damage, and a dice deep dive. We're going to talk about this game design piece. This is a quick look, we're going to come back to it later, at the chart that is going to be used in this Parley to demonstrate this like dice chain size dice and size thing that Pathfinder uses to scale weapon damage. If you've played Dungeons and Dragons, there are similar things in Dungeons and Dragons, though this might not actually be true, but I found this easier to understand personally. This is a really interesting game design tool, so we're going to get to it in just a second, but that's what the Parley is about. A lot of game design stuff to talk about with that, I think, really efficient design idea. So a January Parley. This is from the Witch of Contradiction series, if you've been following those Parley from EyePatchNotes. Let's rewind a bit. EyePatchNotes begins. Zoom out and slow down to better chase 6 rabbits down their rabbit holes. The mention of damage and dice in previous Witch of Contradiction Parley was primarily introduced as a way to contrast Pathfinder familiars, which are small and smaller like wizard buddies, and animal companions, medium and larger druid bodies. As a recap and response to familiar scaling, familiars usually have poor base damage, like 1d4, but there is an option to deal with that. The Mauler subclass, available only to familiars, corrects base damage upward to 1d8-ish. Familiars also usually have poor base strength, such as 3, and are often teeny. But there is an option, the Mauler subclass, which increases strength by 8-ish and also size to medium, the size of typical players, save for gnomes and halflings. And familiars do not learn feats naturally, but there's an option to call to that too. Some familiar subclasses grant feats by name, or player subclasses like Eldritch Guardian provide feat inheritance. There's a little asterisk that says this will be on the test. I imagine we're eventually going to get a combo where the familiar inherits some key feats from the master, your player character's build, but I'll speculate actually a little bit more at the end of this Parley. Pretty interesting. There are lots of ways that you can kind of attack or address each of those aspects of familiars. What is a player to do if their base damage is poor? Unarmed strike damage starts at 1d4, same as daggers, but those hands are free to hold another weapon. Ergo, replacing small dice is a core method to increase player damage. Monks, and indeed beasts, do not have the luxury of replacing their natural weapons, their fists or claws, so they instead scale directly with level, specific to what they are, they don't all scale that way, and size, generically. If anything increases in size, its damage goes up accordingly. And you can see that here with this table. I'm actually going to slightly adjust. Look at that. Beautiful. So here you can see that there's a kind of synchronized damage scaling system where if you increase the potency of the thing you're attacking with, or your natural weapon, or your size, you kind of move up a dice chain. So you can see it down here. It's what you would expect, usually starting at 1d4, then 1d6, 1d8, 1d10, 2d6 instead of 1d12. The idea here is that I guess efficiency linearly has kind of dropped a little bit because you can still get just as low of a number, but you're only increasing how high you can go by a little bit. So when you go from 1d6 to 1d8, you're increasing the range of high numbers by quite a bit. A quarter, I guess, of the results you can get are now higher numbers than before. You can still get a 1, but a relatively large number of the options you can roll have increased, right? Whereas if you have 1d10 and you go to 1d12, a smaller amount than a quarter of the options you can roll have gotten better. You can roll almost all the same things. You only added 2 more numbers you can get, and you can still roll a 1. So most dice chains like this, not just in Pathfinder, opt to switch to 2 dice at that point. And of course, 2d6 has the same average or mean as 1d12, but it means that you're more likely to get a relatively larger number. You increased the low end as well, and increased the consistency at the slight expense of some of the higher numbers. It's a more consistent weapon. I'm not extremely good at abstract probability like this, but in my mind, that is like the reason for multiple dice. It sort of makes sense intuitively to me. I'll tell you what I would rather roll. You know what I mean? If my dungeon master says, hey, you want to roll 1d12 or 2d6? 2d6. I mean, for consistent weapon damage. I mean, I might prefer the randomness for fun sometimes, but certainly if I just want to hit an enemy with my weapon and I wanted to do consistent damage and I have to pick 1d12 or 2d6, I 2d6 all the way. Let's go. Anyway, you can see it continues 2d8, 3d6, 3d8, 4d6, 4d8, etc. Presumably adding more dice more often rather than moving up the dice chain, because again, the sort of consistency thing kicks in. You'd be adding numbers to the pool where the variance would just get ridiculous. It's funny recently because I've been playing a lot of Baldur's Gate 3, and Baldur's Gate 3 summarizes the dice that you roll. You do roll dice for your damage as normal for spells and stuff, but it summarizes them as the range you can get. Sometimes this makes spells look so much worse than they look if you write the dice. So for example, I've been using a lightning damage character, because in Baldur's Gate 3 you get double damage with lightning against wet targets, and it's not very hard to like throw a glass of water at someone and then do double damage. So I have spells that will do things like 4d10 damage. That sounds really good. But when you write 4d10 damage as 4 to 40 damage, it's like, I could do 4 damage with this level 3 spell slot. Like, that's really, really, really bad. Like, it feels so bad. So I personally, I'm in the mode to really appreciate the like multiples of dice. I really like this subject, so forgive me for just completely interrupting the parlay to talk about this. But I personally really appreciate the like rolling multiple dice soon on the table rather than rolling like 2d12 and you hit with your like gigantic great axe and it does, you know, 2 damage. Like, get out of here. In my opinion, in fact, that entire practice, at least in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition and Baldur's Gate 3, could really benefit from having less variable dice and more of like a flat number. So let's take my 4d10 lightning spell from before. 4 to 40 damage, get out of here. I want it to be something like 20 to 36 damage. Like, remove the ceiling a little bit, penalize the ceiling a little bit, but make it so it can't do like 7 damage. You know what I mean? I mean, if you're firing a lightning bolt at someone, in what world will it feel right if that does 4 damage? You know what I mean? It will hardly ever do 4 damage, I know. But anyway, off my high horse, we continue forward with this table for now, actually. Breaking apart that last statement about monks and indeed beasts scaling directly with level sometimes, or their size in general. EyePatchNotes continues, monk or monk-like progression includes slowly increasing unarmed damage to 1d8, 1d10, and beyond. The character's fists and feet thus mature alongside them. Monks can still pick up an actual weapon, but some feats and class features are compatible with unarmed strikes only. We'll talk about Flurry of Blows later. Animal companions being downscaled from true martials like fighters experience just 1 base damage increase at 4th or 7th level. Either form of dice progression is still a safety net, foundation, and hook in tandem with the last concept in this parlay, which is size progression. But just to quickly root the thing we just talked about, so you can see that for the monk, they're progressing along the dice chain quite directly. You can look at it over here. This is kind of more about size. We'll talk about that in just a sec. So they might start with 1d4 on their fists and then progress to 1d6, 1d8, 1d10 until they are punching with damage that is a greatsword if you were to use a physical weapon. But you can also progress along that track with sizes. So if you are a small level 1 monk, you punch for 1d4, and then you move up to medium somehow, or you just play a medium creature instead, you move to 1d6, you jump over like that. And you can see that depending on the situation, you may, it's relatively equivalent to moving 1 or 2 up the dice chain. It's not really my first reaction when I saw this was, oh, is it a multiplier? Not really, no. It's just another way to increase your progression along the chain. It doesn't make it, it's not better if you've progressed your damage more and then you increase your size. It's like just as good or marginally worse, like relative to the damage you have. It's less of a damage increase, I would argue. If you have a lot of damage already and you move up because your size increases, you don't gain more, and relative to what you have, you arguably gain less. It's just another way to get like damage progression. But the main appeal here is that you can basically turn your fists into an ever larger hunk of metal to swing at your enemies, but it's still one fist. Again, we'll get back to that a lot later. I know you sort of can't see this fist, but you kind of can though. Size progression, EyePatchNotes concludes, skirts the line between core mechanic and optional subsystem. With common entities ranging between small and large, size progression provides a framework with which to balance and compensate weapons. Or, well, weapons in the case of monks and beasts. Pathfinder's take on enlarge person moves the target along the size track, turning a medium longsword, 1d8, into a large longsword, 2d6. Note that the end result is similar to that of a medium greatsword. What a large giant considers a short sword, 1d8, it's a short sword but they're large, so 1d8. A medium human handles as a longsword, 1d6, because they're, 1d8 still, because they're medium, but they're using the same thing. And a small gnome handles as a two-handed greatsword, still doing 1d8. Right, so they're meant to be equivalent. I like that from an immersion perspective, right? You get this feeling like the same hunk of metal would be sized such that you wouldn't use that weapon the same way if you were, like a much bigger creature. That makes intuitive sense, sort of. I also gather that large may be like what medium, small, and large, and tiny as well are in various tabletop role-playing games, like how big those creatures are, can make a big difference. Probably more than we have time for in this parlay, but I think that's an interesting subject. In Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, medium and small characters both still occupy like a 5x5 foot square, but large creatures occupy 4 5x5 foot squares, which is like, it's a contrivance for the sake of abstraction, but it does make it feel like there's a bigger jump at that point. And sword nerds out there, I am aware that of course you wouldn't like actually use a hunk of metal the same way, just because it's sized up and now it's the size of a short sword, but it's not like made like a short sword. And so would you really use it like a short sword? And my answer is yes, you would, unless you were formally trained. And if you were formally trained, you probably don't have something that is a great sword to a gnome that you're using as a short sword. Anyway, I think it's interesting. I think this is a good thing for immersion. Like, that's surprisingly elegant to me, very satisfying. There's a lot to unpack in this parlay, which was thankfully cleaved from December. Consider this the first half of a 2 is crossed out 3-parter to properly set the witch's staging. Yes, even with the rules and systems exposition to date, her signature moves ask for yet more background. Soon TM. It seems we are building up to a multi-class that's going to use like a big bongo damage scaled familiar. I'm imagining witch sounds like a class or build that would have a spell like enlarge person and would have a familiar, and so you can get the familiar to be like really, really big and do an inordinate amount of damage they're like not normally supposed to be able to do. That sounds like where we are going. Maybe I'll foreshadow a little more. I don't think monk, I guess we could do that now. The monk thing probably isn't going to be part of that build. I think monk is just a useful example here because it is a class that does the damage scaling ladder thing. And you can see the fists progressing, and EyePatchNotes is just making the point that there are other creatures, like there are other things in Pathfinder that progress the same way. Normally, it might have been more contrived to think of your weapon as evolving, because it kind of doesn't in the same way. I think the first thing I want to talk about in this parlay is how weapon balance figures into this. So going back to the table, one of the things that's really interesting about having a table like this, and especially being dice as well, if you're playing a physical game, or even if you play online, I would really recommend having physical dice because I think it makes this part of the design better, like a more useful piece of game design. A beneficial thing is that it helps there be a granular difference between different weapons without them being completely different. So for example, if you're not familiar as a member of the audience, a short sword will do, maybe 1d6 damage, and a long sword does 1d8 damage, and they both get equipped in one hand. So what is the point of a short sword? Well, it's a finesse weapon, usually. This means you can use it with dexterity instead of just strength, like most melee are well, a lot of melee are stuck with. You can pick whichever one is higher. And it's also light. It's a smaller, lighter weapon. And so light weapons can be dual wielded without having any special, I mean, you would need special training, but you know what I mean, like further special training. In what I'm familiar with, which is 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, you can dual wield longswords, but you need a feat to do that. And you have a very limited supply of those. My understanding is that in Pathfinder, you have a lot less limited supply of feats. So I have some concerns about how balanced that would be in this case. But in 5th edition, in my opinion, it is very balanced. Like, you get a meaningful damage upgrade if you learn to dual wield weapons that are not light, but it has a meaningful but not ridiculous opportunity cost. You can get dual wielding if you want to without borking your character. It has a very appropriate opportunity cost, in my opinion. A lot of martial characters, well, fighters and rogues, get more feats than other characters do in 5th edition as well. So 2 of the characters more likely or more that benefit more from dual wielding have a little bit of an easier time paying 1 feat to get the dual wielding. And again, the damage is fairly substantial. It adds up, if you're making multiple attacks per turn, or your attacks are going to crit and you're going to multiply that damage die, 1d6 to 1d8 seems like not that much. And it's a small enough amount that it's not like short swords are just bad. You feel like you're doing terrible damage if you don't have dual wielding long swords or whatever. But it still allows a little knob. You see what I mean? Combining these stats with something that isn't part of EyePatchNotes Parley too much, but which I think is a really important detail, which is modifiers like a weapon being versatile, which is that you can hold it with 2 hands and do more damage if you swing it with both hands, or being light, you can dual wield it without the dual wielder feat or whatever you need in Pathfinder, or it being finesse, you can use dexterity instead of strength. A big benefit of which is that dexterity benefits more types of characters' armor classes, so dexterity can be a more efficient stat for you to have. You level just dexterity and you can make your melee weapon damage and your armor class better, whereas if you had to level strength for the melee, but then that didn't affect your armor class and you need dexterity for that, it could end up doing less damage in practice for some characters. All of that stuff blends together to create a system where you can have a lot of different weapons and they actually all deserve to exist from a game design perspective. The player may just prefer to use a weapon that is smaller for various reasons. This isn't even just a matter of the weapon being like, it's a fun idea to wield a comma, a single-handed scythe or whatever, and maybe it doesn't do great damage or have good stats, or I think it can. I might require special training or something. But it goes beyond that. It could be things like, I want to be using a dagger because it's easy to conceal. And in the situation we're in my game, that matters. You know what I mean? You might walk into a gala where you're going to assassinate someone. And I would absolutely say to my players, what do y'all look like right now? What do you get that, 2d6 great axe on your back there? Gumble? And Gumble, my obviously dragonborn barbarian that I have in my group, would say, no, I switched to dual wielding maces and I, made them look like some sort of, flag bearer standard thing on my back so that it looks like I'm just like part of the band, here to represent, fly the colors for the adventuring party that we're in, or something. And I would say, okay, make a deception check or an intimidation check, maybe. But okay, sure. You can see how having something like that would maybe be beneficial in a way that doesn't have to do with the damage it's stealing. My point is, having lots of knobs like that, and then also the open-endedness of role-playing or just the preference of which weapons you're using, very, very cool. Just as an aside that isn't like totally part of this parlay, but which I think is an interesting sort of side effect drawback of that design, is that sometimes you'll run into players that want the fantasy of using a certain type of weapon, but the way that the weapon has been implemented in like this involved damage dice ladder system doesn't fit their character at all. Like they're playing a warlock and they want to be using a scythe, but the way that that's implemented in the game or whatever that weapon would be is just incredibly awkward to use with like that class. It wouldn't necessarily be, that's just a random example. But you can imagine how please just forgive Pact of the Blade Hexblade Warlocks from 5th edition. Please just leave me alone for a second. I know. But besides that, you can imagine how being a spellcaster, a scythe would not be an easy weapon to wield in a harmful way without training. You know what I mean? It's a two-handed, heavy object. I guess it's a little bit analogous to a polearm, but you need to use it wholly differently to actually hurt someone with a scythe in combat, let alone the concerns about just breaking the darn thing. And so having it be that the player wants the fantasy of like being a warlock and using a scythe and reaping the dead, but it's actually fairly difficult to translate that into a gameplay benefit in practice, because of the way this system has mostly usefully quantified those things into specific like damage categories with various modifiers like versatile or light or simple or martial or finesse weapons, etc., all that stuff. It can sometimes backfire a little bit. You know, I would not be hesitant as a dungeon master to handwave heavily at this point to say, yeah, I mean, there's no reason you can't like hold a scythe and have it. I do not accept that my fantasy world will not allow you to use a scythe to cast spells. Like that seems totally fine. Like I completely believe that you have your patron said like you're gonna wield this eldritch scythe to strike fear into your enemies and represent the good name of, you know, this badass warlock patron that you have. Sure, you know what I mean? Am I going to let you use that as like a two-handed reach weapon that does 1d12 damage and counts as a glaive? No, I'm probably not, unless you are a hexblade or whatever. I understand, yes. So I don't know, that is just something that's always on my mind about this system, is that some players look at it and go, the weapon that fits my fantasy for what I think would be fun for a character is this, and here it is on the list, and oh, I can't really use those traits that weapon has. The names, basically, are quite frustrating in my opinion. Like, how you do the names for these is tricky. I feel like longsword, short sword, dagger, things like that. These are generic enough names that I hope people wouldn't lock onto them too much. And if people are thinking of like for example, a Kopish, are you familiar with these? It's like an Egyptian ritual sword that has like a curve in it. So it's a like medium-ish length, one-handed sort of, we'll get into it in a second, sword with a curve in it, and sometimes a spike going backward. Let me ask you, is that a short sword or a long sword? The answer is, I think this system helpfully doesn't answer that question. You know what I mean? If you're fantasy, I don't think it would be useful for fighting, by the way, that there are some curved swords like that may have been useful for fighting. One could attempt parrying, I would think. But it seems that historically a Kopish was probably used to behead people, or like just as a formal piece of decoration, less likely in raw combat. That's my understanding anyway. And so, I don't know, we're playing a fantasy game. If you want to use that, I think it does not matter whether we rule it as a short sword or a long sword. I want you to get the appearance of that thing. And then if we need to design a fancy one that has some kind of special maneuver to make it feel like a Kopish. Anyway, I think that's totally doable. But that is well outside the scope of this parlay. I just think it's interesting to consider how this table is a useful piece of game design to balance things and create different fantasies for your weapons, like without necessarily saying this is what like this incredibly specific historical weapon does. Like that, it's helpful, I believe, that it allows you a framework for scaling damage that doesn't attempt to declare that. And indeed, here, EyePatchNotes has mostly not included things that are very specific weapons. It's mostly just swords. Like you have a part you grip, and then there's a length of metal, a mass of metal of some kind that is bladed or pointy or a mix of the two, and it does ascending damage up the rows. Like perfect, you know what I mean? Table difficulty 4 out of 5. Get out of here. This is like the clearest table ever. I think it's clear. Okay, so you kind of already mentioned, EyePatchNotes kind of already mentioned the bit about size progression being a way to balance weapons, but just going further, again, I think it's interesting to see the scaling or opportunity cost. This is the type of thing that you from the outside might think is there really a need for there to be all of these different damage numbers? But it allows you to very quickly know what's going on if you want to see like how much more damage a weapon does. Intuitively, for players of, I think, video game culture, it feels like a long sword, well, it's longer, it should do more damage than a short sword. From a martial perspective, not really, but but okay, you know, and so it does, and this chart exists to make it easy to do that. Actually, this is a part of the parlay where I think the example weapon calculations are useful. EyePatchNotes, you left a few. So case 1 is a medium monk. Base unarmed damage is 1d4, the equivalent of a medium dagger. Taking monk levels at all increases this to 1d6, now the equivalent of a medium short sword. If you're medium, it looks like if you're small, it's still 1d4. And you can see at the bottom here, actually, there is 1d3 and 1d2. So presumably a small creature fights with their fists at base as like 1d3 or 1d2. Is that a thing? Anyway, at case 2, a medium monk at level 6. As the character continues to take levels in the monk class, their unarmed damage increases. Level 6 is halfway to 1d10, but stays at 1d8 until then. 1d8 is the damage of a medium longsword with your fist. And now it's getting good. Case 3, a medium monk at level 5 that is affected by enlarge person. Moving the character to this next size category means that they pull from the next column over. Note that this transition jumps from 1d8 to 2d6, recreating the benefit of a level 12 monk. This will be elaborated on in the next parlay or two. So yeah, you can see here we're a medium monk at level 5, and then you get enlarged, so you go from 1d8 to because you're monk level 4+, so you're here 1d8 medium, and then you jump over to 2d6. You can see here that it appears that when you go up a size category, you jump. Small is confusing me slightly, but from medium to large, you're jumping 2 sizes up the dice chain. So you were at 1d8 here, you skip 1d10 and go to 2d6. Or if you go from 2d6, you see at the bottom of medium down here, you're at 2d6, a large longsword, and you jump to large, you get 3d6, which is 2 up the dice chain. It seems like there might be just some quirk that if you go from medium to small, that just isn't as big of a jump somehow. Kind of going back to the thing I said about like how much of a size increase is medium to large versus small to medium in various games, right? It seems like Pathfinder might be calling to that a little bit. And indeed, because of the cube rule or whatever, you know, if you get bigger by what feels like a regular amount, your mass increases non-linearly. And so if you go from, you know, you're half the height of a whale and you have the same proportions as a whale, but you're just half the height, you are not half the weight of a whale. You know, you're like, I don't remember, but like a quarter or whatever of the weight of a whale, you know? And so if you increase size by what feels like the same amount from the outside, your weight increases by not the same amount. Like you get much heavier. So while I don't think this is something EyePatchNotes cares about quite as much as I do, it's both of our parlay, and I think it is completely reasonable that as you get bigger, the reward for getting bigger gets bigger. I think that sort of makes sense. Anyway, I'm not sure if that's actually what's going on, but that's what it seems like to me. And on this table, you can see again, you're jumping 2 for getting bigger. So in a way, getting a size increase is like sort of a multiplier in that it benefits you a little more if you are bigger already, I guess. You would kind of need to know more about the game to get into that more. But we have a key thing coming up. First, case number 4, a small monk, or one that is affected by reduced person. Size calculation also works in reverse. Going down a size category shrinks the character's weapon damage across the board. A small monk will find it difficult to crest the 2d6 horizon. You would have to be increasing your damage a lot of times, right? If you start as small, you need more damage increases than there seems to be easily accessible to get to a 2d6 damage output. However, this is where things get a little bit juicy, because all this scaling stuff in the system is kind of there for the purpose of equivalating weapons and size changes and stuff, and that's all pretty useful. I hope we've convinced you of that so far. The thing that happens when you do this kind of design, though, is that sometimes other parts of the design sort of, there's something like weird comes up, and this is where the weird payoff comes. One of the understated nuances of increasing base damage is that handedness is left intact. Unarmed strikes are considered light, meaning you get finesse. You can scale them with dex instead of strength if your dex is higher, and two-weapon fighting. While not a perfect recreation of dual-wielding greatswords, the monk has limbs with similar or even superior damage dice. Flurry of Blows, one of the monk's claims to fame, is also compatible with unarmed strikes, but not greatswords. So it's not as if you could just pick up a greatsword and do the same things. The monk can punch you twice with, when fully scaled, the damage of 2 greatswords, one in each hand, which you cannot do in 5th edition, at least not in any way I can think of easily. Increasing your size, ask your dungeon master. I would probably say yes, if you increase your size enough, which you can totally do. But the point is that you can not only punch twice, monks also have a number of features that let them punch a few extra times. Flurry of Blows, 2 more punches as a bonus action, and that means 2 more greatsword attacks as a bonus action is getting a little out of hand at that point. Like, that's crazy. And you can see how that's sort of a weird byproduct of the way that the system has tried to create a dice chain to equivalate weapons in size. And then the monk is going to scale their fists, and so there's the dice chain right there to scale that. But the result is that the monk can punch you 4 times with a greatsword. In each hand is a greatsword. They can quad fist you with greatswords. It's a lot. That's a ton of damage. And it's very consistent too, because it's all 2d6s. Anyway, that whole situation. EyePatchNotes, you actually address the sort of table inconsistency I mentioned too, which I feel like is worth mentioning, because if an aspiring build maker or game breaker, math finder, is looking at the idea of punching 4 times with a greatsword in each hand and thinking, what if I make myself even bigger? Great. You will probably want to know about the idiosyncrasies of the size increase thing. EyePatchNotes says, for the dice progression table in the corner, 1d8 is expected to skip 1d10 in many contexts. The monk table contains several formula inaccuracies. It could be that the core rulebook being printed before size manipulation became a system-wide phenomenon. Mostly not a deal breaker. This will be covered next time, but next has an asterisk. Indeed, it sounds like you might be saying that it's just inconsistent. And that's the final through line I want to talk about with this parlay, is that this is sort of beautiful consistency until it isn't. You've been talking about like optional subsystem and things being consistent throughout this parlay. And at first, when I started this parlay, when I read it the first time, I wasn't totally sure what you meant, but I think I do know what you mean. There's this feeling like things become systemic over time. You know, the game creates that piece of design, and imagine if monks scaled their damage with just like something else. They just scale, the damage increased, but it was some kind of irregular method of the damage increasing. That would take a chip into how much this feels like the system the game uses. What if Enlarge Person said you increase your damage by 1d6? No matter what it is, you just roll 1 more d6. That would take another chip into this feeling like this is the system you have. And all those things could add up. This is an interesting parlay for me to keep in mind, that in game design, it's not often about, you know, you've established this as the standard table. It's basically a matter of numerical consistency. How many times when it would be reasonable to use the thing that is the systemic expectation, do you use the systemic expectation? I think that a frustration I've had with Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, for example, is that because it's built with kind of 2 problems that I'll get back to in a second, you often find subclasses and features in the game using technology that is not regular. It's not necessarily an unreasonable idea inherently, but it's just not very regular. The 2 kind of opposing tensions are that 1, it has a lot of baggage from previous D&D. It's attempting, for largely marketing purposes, to look like older D&D. And 2, that it produced a lot of supplements over a long period of time. And what's better, sticking to the design that you know is flawed in a certain way, or making new design that is better in a vacuum but inconsistent? And the answer is stop hitting yourself. And so the result is that there are lots of things in 5th edition where it's not a form of making builds I'm a very big fan of, where it feels like you can do some powerful stuff, but it's usually by exploiting something that if you were to do things again, you probably wouldn't design that way. So a simple example from our good old friend the Hexblade is that they have this debuff they can do where this is a warlock wielding a weapon. They're granted like a magical, eldritch weapon from their patron. Their patron is the spirit of haunted weapons. Let's not get into this, but however you rule a Hexblade, they get the ability to sort of mark an enemy and do extra damage to them. And the damage scales with their proficiency bonus. Very few things in 5th edition scale with blank. Lots of things. One of them is proficiency bonus. And there are things in D&D that use essentially all the things you could put in that blank. There will be some ability that obscurely scales with X, Y, or Z. And this is the one that scales with proficiency. The result being that you can take one level of this subclass, leave, and get a shocking amount of the benefit because it continues to scale. Your proficiency is just a thing about your character. Another similar example in Baldur's Gate 3 is that if you take one level of Wizard, well, one of Wizard's gimmicks is that they can spend gold to transcribe spells they find written on spell scrolls, and therefore learn them. They do still have to prepare the spells. They have to choose the roster of spells they can use in any given fight, which is limited. So it's not like they can just be accessing every spell they could learn, but you can swap that spell in. You know it now. You can cast it with your spell slots if you swap it into one of your limited prepared slots. The wizard can learn spells of the level of spell slot they have access to, which that's just the level of spell they're supposed to have access to, right? If they're a single class wizard. But if you take one level in wizard and then get spell slots from other classes, you can learn any wizard spell that you have spell slots for. It doesn't matter if they're from being a wizard, which means you can play a spellcaster of some other kind for 9 levels, take one level in wizard, and then just learn like 2/3 of the wizard spell list with that one level in wizard. Level 4 wizard spells, go nuts. That doesn't make sense. Like, it's kind of interesting. It causes its own kind of chaotic emergent build options, but it's not sensible game design, in my opinion. There's a big trade-off there where, yeah, it allows mostly really overpowered optionality to the player, but I think that most people will find as their knowledge of the game expands further and further that it's increasingly a frustration or a liability. You have to pretend you can't do that, or you're almost always worse off if you don't do it, which doesn't feel that good when the game is encouraging you to make choices. The choices are kind of fake, you found out over time. I like this type of system because I feel like it generally counters that type of phenomenon. It tries to standardize things in a way where you won't be able to do something that just feels overbearing, and there are just going to be corner cases where you can leverage the system to do something powerful, but it's not absurd. Like, the monk can punch with fist greatswords, but I mean, they're ultimately doing a thing you could do if you just swung a greatsword a lot of times, which I'm sure other characters in Pathfinder can do. You know what I mean? They're not doing something wholly unique that breaks the rules that 99% of the rest of the system follows. They're doing something very powerful, but which obeys the rules of the system that it's in. I think that's an interesting, meaningful difference. Now, EyePatchNotes, we have to talk about some stuff. You said that you thought you left a summary that I actually didn't use this time. I didn't feel like I needed it. And you said, just a disclaimer, that I totally expect this parlay to miss, and that is okay. This is a system that I came to terms / peace with years ago, and is not intuitive or natural without a similar background. You're probably talking about Mathfinder. It is somewhat logical when explained, though, hence my belief and explanation that Mathfinder is auditable. I totally agree. I think this was one of the easier ones to understand. I think part of why is that you focused on a very specific piece of systemic design, and another kind of sub facet of that is that you focused on a piece of good design, I would argue. I'm not saying that it's bad to do parlay that from you or anyone else that are not focused on pieces of good design, but as someone who talks about these pieces of design for a living, and this parlay was pretty close to something I would do for a Zannypants channel video, which also made it easier to do, but anyway, I can tell you it's a lot easier to discuss good game design. It's just easier to do. Usually the reason is that it's systemic. If you explain it from the outside, from a good perspective, that perspective is useful when you go into the weeds. A lot of not as good design is defined surprisingly completely, in my opinion, by it being just inconsistent. And so you can't give a kind of neat explanation because the design just isn't neat. And one of the reasons it's not that good usually is that it does things a lot of different ways, which is confusing for the player, but one of them is just like better than the other ways to do it most of the time. And the designer simply didn't do that other times. I think that for Monk, you can see how there might be some minor balance concerns for having the monks scale their damage this way, but I feel like it more than makes up for that in the simplicity and elegance and understandability of that damage scaling, and understanding that monks have this unique feature where they scale damage just like you do by holding different weapons, but like with their fists. Their fists upgrade to be like bigger and bigger weapons, as it were. Very cool. Like I feel like when you read that class for the first time in Pathfinder, if you know about this dice damage system, you played a few times before, you played a fighter and upgraded your weapons or whatever, and then you get this, you think, I don't have to change the opportunity cost of what I'm holding or whatever, and my fists just increase in damage as if I was getting bigger and bigger weapons. That's crazy. Maybe your previous experience, you were dual wielding short swords, you got the dual wielder feat and swapped to long swords, and your damage scaled a little bit, you had that experience. But mostly you were locked to what traits do the weapons that I'm holding have, and do they fit my build? Whereas now you just get to scale on that table. Hell yeah, like that's awesome. But it also just kind of makes sense. It's easy to understand at a glance because it is an elegant piece of design. And yet it's also bounded. The weapons are balanced by being arrayed on that table. And so putting the monk fists on that table does feel inherently bounded in some way, in a way that makes for good emergent balance. I think that this is one of the key ways that you can make a game that's very open-ended, as Pathfinder sure seems to be, relatively balanced without checking every single option. You can't really check every single option, but you can make it inherently more easy for the balance to be coherent, for things to be of a similar power level, or similarly good ideas to be of a similarly good power level, by making things systemic like this. It is a sort of cruise control where if you make a good system one time and then you keep using it when it's appropriate, in theory, you don't need to worry about, will this new thing be like rebalanced sensibly? This goes all the way back to an early Parley EyePatchNotes did in this series, where we talked about how one of the things that appeals to you about Pathfinder is how things are more exchangeable. Like there are you get more feats, and a lot of feats are essentially the same benefit as like a subclass feature or something. And that means that you can kind of exchange resources more freely. This happens in some games we've played too, like Warframe comes to mind. You can often spend a mod slot on your Warframe to get base damage on your weapon that is comparable to if you spent one slot on your weapon. You just might have to do something slightly different. A simple example would be Vigorous Swap is a Warframe mod, and Serration, a weapon mod for primaries. They give you the same base damage. Vigorous Swap does give it to all your weapons, but you can't use them all at the same time. Vigorous Swap just requires that you swap to that weapon like recently, that you swap to it recently to get the damage. But otherwise you get, like, I believe literally the same damage if memory serves. This is fully intentional. I mean, it's meant to be that you can kind of more freely structure the builds that you're building on your weapons and frames if you're willing to abstract a little bit. I think that's pretty interesting. And keeping those numbers relatively consistent does allow for some relatively stable balance. It's not like you can't add more base damage to your weapon on your weapons build. So adding more base damage to your weapon from your Warframe build, while it does mean that you have an extra mod slot, sort of, you're still going to have a ton of weapon damage and lose, relative benefit on having so much weapon damage already and then adding more. And so it still obeys the basic rules of the system. It's still bounded by the same laws. It's not like a new type of damage multiplier that you're adding in, except when it is, I know, but Warframe things. That type of system, I think, is a very good way to kind of fundamentally balance games, to make it so things feel coherent and relatively fair, and yet you can still get advantages. You can still meaningfully increase your damage, but the game is relatively safe in the knowledge that the player won't usually be able to increase their damage by gigantic amounts, leading to meaningful build decisions that make you better off, that will reliably not be really broken compared to everything else. Other things will still feel like good options without you needing to necessarily manually check every single option. Not because you shouldn't manually check, but because you can't manually check. Generally, there's just too many things. I am the first person, as you may be familiar, audience, and EyePatchNotes is familiar, as being an incredibly foaming at the mouth, intense advocate for playtesting, but I think it's equally important to emphasize how you can make systems work better from the start, from the ground up. Many games I've played that don't do well in this category both don't have good systemic systems or like good design in these types of areas, and don't seem to have playtested that much. So it's not as if the only problem is that they just needed more people to play the game. There is a further underlying problem. And while I think it's good to focus on both, I mean, it would have helped a lot to do either better. Even if they only did one of them better, it would still help a lot. I've seen games that get this part so good and then clearly didn't do amazing playtesting, but it's not bad because they got that part so right, or did like an insane amount of playtesting. So even though they really didn't do the systemic design thing, it's surprisingly coherent when you get to the game. So while I wouldn't it just isn't efficient to not do both, like to do a little of both would be much better than doing one really hard and neglecting the other. It doesn't seem like most game studios are doing that, so I think it's not bad to emphasize the benefit of this type of system. I'm a very big fan. I think it's cool. It's pretty satisfying to wrap back around to this too, right? You kind of talked about this in earlier Parley, indirectly, EyePatchNotes. You could sort of give me an understanding of Pathfinder, which I only know about through EyePatchNotes Parley. That made me expect things like this, I guess, and now we've seen one that's sort of a really good example. I think that's very, very cool. On the other hand, the thing I mentioned about like systemic irregularities, things like you take one level of wizard and you can learn basically all of the wizard spells, provided you've progressed spellcaster levels with something else, or, you know, you take one level in Hexblade and then you get to scale that feature, even though pretty much every other similar feature wouldn't scale unless you took levels in that class, because they just like change their mind. Like there isn't really a reason from a balance or game development perspective. They essentially just did something different in the grand scheme of 5th edition, more or less at random in that case. I feel similarly to some extent about a previous Witch of Contradiction Parley where we talked about different companions and their scaling, animal companions and familiars. But one thing I noticed that was really interesting is that they still have proper opportunity cost in some way. Like one thing we talked about in that Parley is how your animal companion could scale with relevant levels in the class you got it from. Your familiar doesn't, and would be weaker at the start, but there are ways to make it stronger with further investment. That feels inherently fair. So even though the systems kind of result in like, oh, you can take advantage of familiars not scaling anyway by just not taking a bunch of levels in that class and investing in something else, you can do that, but there is some trade-off for that. You know, the system notices that and says, okay, well, they're going to start with lower damage and you have to pay a relatively high opportunity cost to get, you know, the feats that will make them strong and worthwhile. So while you don't have to take levels in this class, you have to do work elsewhere that you wouldn't have otherwise needed to do. If we had more time with this topic, another related-ish subject, but that we just don't have time for at all, is the way in which more default or like less complicated options are given relative power or power balanced against other options. You can see here, if you've watched a lot of the Witch of Contradiction Parley so far, that you could simplify the relationship between familiars and animal companions as animal companions are better the less complicated your build is. It seems to me anyway. And I think that that is a complicated, important aspect of these systems that would really take some time to unpack. Maybe I'll do it as a main channel video. But for real, EyePatchNotes, I know it's a little hollow coming from me because I'm the one like I'm doing this for money that you paid me, but I do these all the time for money that you pay me. And I personally thought this was one of the easier ones to follow. And those are some reasons why, or some things that I liked. I felt like it was worth doing. I did like an extra 10 minutes on that, but because I think it's interesting. So I hope you did too. I thought it was fun. I'm looking forward to finding out. I know you kept us in suspense a bit, but it's okay. I mean, you're establishing lots of detail we need to know. It's going to be pretty fulfilling to see this build. It's getting to the point where I'm going to have to play it. You know what I mean? Like, we have to play some Pathfinder now. We'll figure out something somehow. Thank you very much for the parlay. Looking forward to the next one.